Welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk here at RSA 2025. Terry Sweeney with Dark Reading, and joining me now is Sachin Jade, Chief Product Officer with Cyware. Sachin, thank you so much for joining us on the Dark Reading News Desk.
No, thank you, Terry, for having me.
We are talking about operationalizing threat intelligence with AI and, of course, automation. We know the threat landscape is always changing. Talk a little bit about what the current threat intel data can tell us about what organizations should prepare for.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, organizations over the past 20 odd years or so have been looking at threat intelligence in multiple different facets. And what's happened over the last 5 odd years or so is the explosion of data across all the entire attack surface vector. And so what organizations are looking for now is a starting point where they can figure out how to triage it and more likely what action they should be taking. So the intel data that's coming in has that starting point, but there is a gap, which is how do I operationalize and what actions do I take with it?
So AI, by its very name, is bringing more intelligence to that process, has superior filtering, and of course this automation piece. I mean, history has shown that security professionals are just regularly deluged with the threat intel data that you alluded to. Talk a bit about how they can really sort of dive into it and ferret out those bits that are particularly useful to them.
Yeah, so there is a word that I typically use, or a couple of words, if you will, intel obesity, which is there is this whole concept of there's so much of data, and so it's just growing exponentially. Where do I find the signal, and where do I kind of weed out the noise? And so most security professionals are looking for that unknown and trying to leverage interesting tool sets for them to understand what is important and what is relevant to them. Because a lot of the time things happen, but it still might not be relevant to you. And so from that intel obesity standpoint, how do you start figuring out those attack surface and attack components that are relevant to you? And so in our thought process and our hypothesis and our product offerings as well, what we kind of bring towards that whole notion is there is things happening outside in the external side, and then there is your internal ecosystem that you have your assets, you have your infrastructure, you have your employees, etc. What is important? Let me take a case in point. Let's say you have your employees, you have your contractors, and their credentials have been leaked, unfortunately. Now you need to start figuring out, okay, this is in the dark web, you know, it could be in your social media, Telegram channels, etc. Are they real? Are they just fake? Somebody just made up some of these users? So I need to wait to find out in this vast amount of data, what is relevant to me? Are these like 100% of these that are being quote unquote sold in the dark web, are they all relevant to me? Have they all been compromised? When was it compromised? Oh, and by the way, after it has been compromised, did we take care of the situation, or is the risk still high? So those are the things that security analysts are kind of dabbling with and trying to figure out, how do I make sense of that? And we also try to hone in on that to see how do we give you that bits of information so that you can take those decisions.
Sure. I mean, you also used the word triaging a few minutes ago. I mean, this is a sort of a personalized customization of that triaging process that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah. So because of that, explosion of data and the attack surface vector, what that personalization means is not only is this data relevant to me, the risk impact of that data that is relevant to me, and the way I want to operationalize or take action is also relevant to me. XYZ industry or XYZ company may have taken an action against it, but that might not be the same action that I want to take. Case in point, in that same compromised credential scenario, maybe some other corporates are trying to figure out how do I completely block the users directly. Maybe my governance risk policies are more catered towards, let me figure out the risk. It's higher risk for my executives, lower risk for my other folks, maybe somebody who's dealing with finance. really high risk that we found out in the Hong Kong case, where somebody used a deep fake for the CFO to actually sign the, authorize the money transfer. So how do you start taking care? So these are all different scenarios. So that personalization in terms of finding out the data for you, what is relevant for you, and the actioning capability around that. All of these things are important.
Let's shift gears slightly to talk about collaboration. We're seeing more industry sector, intra-industry collaboration than we've ever seen before. There's a lot of cross-industry sharing of threat intel data. Any thoughts on how this kind of collaboration can be expanded?
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. So we have this whole concept and hypothesis around our product offering as well, which we call operationalizing threat intelligence and collective defense. The whole notion of collective defense is very similar to neighborhood watch. The more people in your neighborhood, in your area, kind of understand what the threats are, the better protected you are as a whole. To make that happen, if I can give you the data that I believe is important to you, and you take the actions that are relevant to you. So this very notion came from the book Team of Teams, if you will, right? Which was about me having, everybody in that ecosystem having the same data, but you can take the decisions that are appropriate to you. So for example, in this intra-sector collaboration, and if I take an example of financial services, the larger banks may be having much more data that they might be dealing with for decisions that they take. Now that data is also important for the smaller banks, but they might be taking decisions that might be different. But this sharing is extremely important. Now if I expand that and take it to the next level, where even the smaller banks, what decisions they take is also now given as a feedback back to the larger banks. The larger banks know what is the risk profile of the banks that they work with in a financial services institution landscape, and they can take some appropriate decision to say which data is important for them and for the others.
Thanks for that. We were talking before we sat down about AI equals automation, and that's true. It's always been true, and I'm not quibbling with it, but at some point AI had to move beyond just this sort of general purpose automation marketing feature. It feels like this is in fact happening, but I'm wondering if you can help us better understand how threat intelligence, AI, and automation have finally found their way and are delivering like real benefits to security professionals.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I would say about a couple of decades ago, and I've been in this space for quite some time, my first company that I built was also with respect to big data, some components around neural networks. But it was still very hard to do it because the scale was needed, the cost was not optimal, etc. And now we are in a situation at that inflection point where you have a lot of data, you can start collaborating as we just spoke about it, but at the same time you have these models that can be applied appropriately. So case in point in that exact example of compromised credentials, it is so fascinating because sometimes what happens is once these compromised credentials are observed, it takes a long time to figure out what to do with it. But with AI, now not only have I figured out the risk profile of the data that came in, very quickly understood that these are, some of them are real users. They are connected to your identity access management systems, so they are real users. Oh, and by the way, some of them have already changed their password and credentials, so they're not at that high risk. Some of them have adhered to the governance policy systems, etc. And last but not the least is that operationalization capability with respect to actioning, and AI starts to action it on your behalf if you want it to. So not only did it take the decision around the automation piece of it, but the actioning piece of it. So that's how it starts to, everything starts to come together.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm wondering if you can take us out with some predictions around how threat intelligence evolves over the next 3 to 5 years. It feels like its trajectory has been supercharged with the advent of AI. But again, that's maybe getting ahead of ourselves. What do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, without having an 8 ball in my hand, my thought process.
Ask again later. Right?
My thought process is around kind of 3 dimensions. One is the need to do more with less. Second is the notion of threat, the definition of threat and intel becoming all-encompassing in one way, shape, or form, so that the attack surface vector starts to be addressed appropriately. And last but not the least, when you talk to CISOs, they're trying to figure out, is there a mechanism where I can have a system or a fabric that dynamically changes based on what the environment is? And so my quote-unquote prediction, if I had one, is a creation of a platform, if you will, that responds to how the ecosystem is changing, leveraging, and being supercharged by AI.
Kind of a mood ring for the SOC, eh?
Would love that.
Sachin, thank you so much for joining us on the Dark Reading News Desk. This has been some great insights, and I appreciate you adding some substance to the claimed benefits of automation via AI. Thank you so much for doing this.
Terry, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure as always, and hopefully the audience also finds this useful. Thank you.
We've been talking with Sachin Jade of Cyware. This has been Terry Sweeney for the Dark Reading News Desk. Thanks again for joining us for this segment. We'll see you next time.